Eleanor's hand rested on the salon door handle, her fingers cold against the brass despite the warmth of the May afternoon. Inside, a woman's voice, light, bitter, edged with something Eleanor couldn't name, cut through the silence. Your wife is a fool if she doesn't see what you're sacrificing. Eleanor pushed the door open, stepped into the room, and said, "Say it louder." The woman at the window turned, pale, startled, visibly unwell, and Eleanor saw what she had spent 3 months preparing to confront. Lady Vivien Hale, the woman her husband visited on Tuesday afternoons, standing in the Ashworth salon with Sebastian between them, like a man watching 2 collisions happen at once. He said nothing. His silence confirmed every assumption Eleanor had built over 90 days of methodical investigation. The scene froze. Vivien's hand at her throat, Sebastian's jaw tight, Eleanor's pulse hammering in her ears. And then the world tilted backward. 7 years earlier, Eleanor had married Sebastian Ashworth in the chapel at Pemberton House, with 400 guests watching and her hand trembling in his. He had held her fingers through the entire ceremony, thumb pressed against her knuckles. And when the vicar paused to clear his throat, a subtle reminder that physical contact during vows was not customary. Sebastian had not let go. She had looked at him and seen a man who could not stop touching her even in front of half the peerage. And she had thought, "This is what my mother never had. This is what I will keep." The marriage that followed had been genuine. 2 sons born, Thomas at 23, James at 26, and a partnership that felt like the rarest thing in their world. A love match that survived its own wedding. Sebastian consulted her on estate decisions. She accompanied him to London during the season and felt no unease when he disappeared into his club for hours. They shared a bed every night he was home, and when he traveled, he wrote her letters that contained actual sentences about what he had seen and thought, not the polite nothings most husbands sent. 18 months ago, something changed. He began arriving late to dinner, distracted, smelling faintly of jasmine. Eleanor did not grow in her garden. He stopped asking her opinion on tenant disputes. He took meetings in London and did not explain their purpose. At first, she told herself it was a state business. Complicated, dull, the sort of thing husbands managed alone. Then she found the glove. It had been tucked into the inner pocket of his traveling coat, small and ivory-colored, yet made of kid-skin so fine it could only belong to a woman of rank. Eleanor had held it in her hand in the middle of their dressing room and felt the floor tilt beneath her. She did not confront him. She did not weep. She folded the glove, placed it back where she had found it, and began to investigate. 3 months of discreet inquiry. Questions posed to her maid, observations noted in her private journal, a visit to the modiste who had made the glove. Led her to a name, Lady Vivien Hale, younger brother's widow, lived quietly in a modest London townhouse, received Sebastian on Tuesday afternoons when her household was reduced to a single servant. Eleanor did not need more than that. The pattern was sufficient. Her mother's husband had kept a mistress for 20 years, and her mother had smiled through every dinner party, every public appearance, every private humiliation, because that was what women of their class did. Eleanor had sworn at 16, standing in her mother's dressing room while her mother pretended not to notice the scent of another woman's perfume on her father's coat, that she would never perform contentment over private misery. So she stopped investigating and started preparing. She opened a separate account with her own solicitor, a man her father had trusted, a man who owed Sebastian no loyalty. She identified a cottage in Hampshire, small but sufficient, and leased it under her maiden name. She arranged for funds to be transferred quietly, in increments that would not draw attention. She did not tell her maid where they were going. She did not tell her sons. She simply built the architecture of departure piece by piece until the day she stood outside the salon door and heard a woman laugh. Now, in the frozen moment after Eleanor had spoken, Vivien Hale looked not triumphant, but alarmed. Her hand rose to her throat, fingers pressing against the hollow there as though she were struggling to breathe. Sebastian stood between them, his expression unreadable, and said nothing. Eleanor turned and walked out. She did not run. She did not slam the door. She walked through the corridor, up the stairs, into the private sitting room she and Sebastian had shared for 7 years. And she sat in the chair by the window until the light outside turned gold. Sebastian found her there 2 hours later. He closed the door behind him, crossed the room, and stopped 3 feet from her chair. "Eleanor?" She interrupted him. "I am leaving." He went still. "What?" "I am not asking your permission. I am informing you of a decision I have already made." She kept her voice level, her hands folded in her lap. "I have leased a cottage in Hampshire. I will depart within 3 days. The boys will remain here with their governess until I am settled, and then I will send for them." "Eleanor, please." "I do not need to hear what you were doing with her." She looked at him directly, her gaze steady. "I need you to understand that I am not my mother. I will not perform contentment over private misery. I will not smile at dinner parties while you visit another woman on Tuesday afternoons. I will not pretend I do not know." Sebastian's face went pale. "You don't understand. I understand perfectly." She stood, smoothed her skirts, and walked past him toward the door. "I will inform the housekeeper in the morning. You may tell the boys whatever you think appropriate." "Eleanor, wait." She stopped at the door but did not turn. "For what?" "Let me explain." She said quietly, "No." She opened the door. "You have had 18 months to explain. You chose silence. I am choosing departure." She left him standing in the sitting room and did not look back. The next 3 days passed in a blur of logistical precision. Eleanor instructed her maid to pack only what they would need for a month. Clothing, personal items, nothing that would suggest permanence. She wrote letters to her solicitor confirming the arrangements. She visited the nursery twice each day, holding Thomas and James longer than usual, memorizing the weight of them in her arms. Sebastian did not attempt to stop her. He appeared at meals, and spoke politely when the boys were present, and avoided her gaze when they were alone. On the morning of her departure, he stood in the drive and watched as the carriage was loaded. Eleanor climbed inside, settled into her seat, and looked out the window one last time. Sebastian stood with his hands at his sides, his face unreadable, and made no move to approach. The carriage lurched forward. Eleanor did not wave. She kept her eyes on the road ahead and told herself this was the right choice, the only choice, for a woman who refused to become her mother. But as the miles stretched between her and Ashworth, certainty did not bring peace. It brought only the hollow vindication of being right about betrayal. 9 days passed in the Hampshire cottage, and Eleanor discovered that solitude felt less like freedom and more like exile. The cottage was charming. Stone walls, a garden overgrown with wild roses, windows that overlooked a valley Eleanor would have found beautiful under different circumstances. Her maid, loyal and silent, kept the household running with minimal staff. Eleanor spent her days reading, walking the grounds, and writing letters to her sons that contained careful reassurances and no explanations. At night, she lay awake in a bed that felt too large and replayed the salon scene in her mind. Vivien's startled face, Sebastian's silence. The way he had stood between them, as though he were caught, guilty, unable to defend himself. And yet, something about the memory did not sit cleanly. Vivien had not looked triumphant. She had looked alarmed. No, more than that. She had looked frightened. And Sebastian's silence had not been the silence of a man caught in an affair. It had been the quiet of someone who could not find words. Eleanor sat up in bed on the 9th night and realized she had left Ashworth without proof. She had left with pattern recognition. Sebastian's behavior matched her mother's husband's behavior, so she had assumed the same cause. But she had not actually seen evidence of an affair. She had seen a glove, a name, and a series of Tuesday absences. She needed to know. Not for confrontation, not for vindication, for clarity. The following morning, she returned to Ashworth. She arrived during the day, while Sebastian was in London, and let herself into the house through the side entrance. The staff did not question her. She was still the Duchess, still mistress of the house, even if she no longer lived there. She went directly to Sebastian's study, closed the door behind her, and began to search. She expected love letters, sentimental tokens, evidence of the affair she had spent 3 months assuming. Instead, she found legal documents, land transfer papers, solicitor correspondence addressed to someone named Greaves, a thick file labeled Pemberton Estate, Vivien Hale, beneficiary. Eleanor pulled the documents from the desk drawer and spread them across the surface, trying to make sense of what she was reading. Parcels of land, deeds, a letter from Greaves discussing restitution protocols and fraud mitigation. She did not understand. She gathered the documents, placed them in her traveling case, and left Ashworth before anyone could ask why she had come. 2 hours later, she sat in the office of Mr. Halford, and her father's former solicitor, and watched his face go pale as he read. "Where did you get these?" Halford asked, his voice quiet. "My husband's study." Eleanor leaned forward in her chair. "What are they?" Halford set the papers down, removed his spectacles, and looked at her with an expression she could not name. "Your Grace, do you know who Lady Vivien Hale is?" "My husband's mistress." He shook his head slowly. "No. Lady Vivien Hale is your husband's late brother's widow." Eleanor went still. "Robert's widow?" He nodded. "Yes. These are restitution papers. Someone is attempting to return property that was fraudulently obtained." Eleanor's pulse hammered in her ears. "I don't understand." Halford picked up one of the deeds and pointed to a signature at the bottom. "This document transfers 3 parcels of land, Lady Vivien's dowry lands, into the Ashworth estate. The signature is attributed to the late Duke of Ashworth, your husband's father. But the transfer occurred 2 years ago, 6 months before the old Duke died. The timing is suspicious." "Suspicious how?" "The old Duke was bedridden for the last year of his life. He did not conduct estate business. He could not have signed this document." Halford set the deed down. "Someone forged his signature." Eleanor stared at him. "Who?" "Based on the correspondence in this file, I believe it was Robert Ashworth." Halford opened the thickest folder and pulled out a letter. Old, seawater stained. The ink faded. "This is a confession. Written aboard ship. Robert admits to forging the documents and transferring his wife's dowry lands into the family estate. He stole from her, Your Grace. And your husband has been trying to return what was taken." Eleanor took the letter with trembling hands and read. Robert's handwriting, slanted and hurried, filled the page. He described the forgery in detail, how he had traced their father's signature, how he had filed the documents while the old Duke was too ill to notice, how he had justified it to himself as a temporary measure to cover gambling debts. He begged Sebastian to take care of Vivien and the boy. "I have destroyed enough." Eleanor set the letter down. "Robert is dead," he confirmed quietly. "Yes, he drowned at sea 2 years ago." Halford pulled another document from the file, a medical report. "Lady Vivien is dying. Consumption. The physician estimates she has months, perhaps weeks." Eleanor's hands went cold. "Sebastian has been meeting with her." "To arrange the restitution, yes." Halford tapped the correspondence from Greaves. "But there is a complication. If the forgery becomes public knowledge, the fraud nullifies Lady Vivien's marriage settlement retroactively. She loses her widow's pension. Her son loses his inheritance claim to the secondary estate Robert left him. Your husband has been attempting to restore the lands privately, through legal channels that do not expose the crime." Eleanor sat in the chair and felt 3 months of architectural certainty collapse beneath her. "Every meeting," she said slowly, "every Tuesday afternoon, was a legal consultation." Halford closed the file. Your husband has been working with Lady Vivien's solicitor to undo a fraud committed by a dead man without destroying the dead man's wife in the process." Eleanor looked at the document spread across Halford's desk. The evidence of a crime she had misread as evidence of an affair, and realized she had been wrong. Not about Sebastian's secrecy, not about his absences, but about their cause. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Halford pulled another letter from the file and handed it to her. "This is from Lady Vivien to your husband, dated 14 months ago. She begs him not to involve anyone else. She feared exposure would reach the courts before the restitution was complete." Eleanor read the letter. Vivien's handwriting was small, precise, desperate. She wrote, "I know what I am asking of you, and I know the cost of silence. But my son's future depends on secrecy. If society learns what Robert did, the scandal will destroy what little he left us. Please, I beg you, do not tell anyone, not even your wife." Eleanor folded the letter and placed it on the desk. She looked at Halford. "She is dying," he confirmed. "Yes. And Sebastian has been trying to save her son's inheritance." He said simply, "Yes." Eleanor stood, gathered the documents, and placed them back in her traveling case. "Thank you, Mr. Halford." "Your Grace." Halford rose from his chair. "What will you do?" Eleanor looked at him. "I am going to speak to Lady Vivien." Vivien Hale's London townhouse was smaller than Eleanor had expected. A modest address in a quiet square, the sort of residence a widow might maintain on a limited income. Eleanor stood at the door for a long moment before knocking. A maid answered, elderly and wary. Eleanor gave her name, her title actually, because rank opened doors that courtesy could not, and waited in the small entrance hall while the maid disappeared upstairs. 5 minutes later, Eleanor was shown into a sitting room on the first floor. Vivien Hale sat in a chair by the window, visibly unwell. She was thin, her hands trembling as she poured tea, her skin pale in a way that suggested illness, not fashion. She looked up as Eleanor entered, and her expression shifted from confusion to understanding. "Your Grace," Vivien said quietly. She did not stand. "I did not expect you." Eleanor crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite. "I came to ask you a question." Vivien set the teapot down carefully. What question?" "What did you mean?" Eleanor said, her voice steady. "When you called me a fool?" Vivien went still, her hands stilled in her lap. "You heard me," she confirmed. I did. Vivien closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and looked at Eleanor directly. I did not know you were at the door. I would not have spoken so carelessly if I had. That is not an answer. Vivien took a slow breath. I was not mocking you, Your Grace. I was warning your husband that his silence was destroying his marriage. I said you would be a fool not to see what he was sacrificing. I meant it as a rebuke to him, not an insult to you. Eleanor studied the woman across from her. Pale, trembling, clearly unwell, and felt the last of her certainty crumble. You were not laughing at me. She said softly, No, I was angry at myself. Though I have cost your husband 18 months of peace, and it seems, his wife's trust. I am the fool, Your Grace. I asked him to carry my secret because I was afraid, and I did not count the cost to him. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Why did you need secrecy? Vivien looked down at her hands. If society learns that Robert forged the land transfers, the fraud nullifies my marriage settlement retroactively. My widow's pension disappears. My son, he is 8 years old, loses his inheritance claim to the estate Robert left him. Your husband has been trying to restore what Robert stole without exposing what Robert did. I begged him not to tell anyone, including you, because every additional person who knows is a risk to my son's future. Eleanor sat back in her chair. You were not his mistress. She said quietly, No. I was his burden, and I asked him to carry a secret that was not his to carry, and I knew it would hurt him. I knew it would hurt his marriage. But I was terrified, Your Grace. I am dying. Consumption. The physicians give me months. My son will have nothing if the forgery is exposed. So I asked your husband to save my child's future, and I did not think about what it would cost him to do it in silence. Eleanor looked at the woman across from her. Not a rival, not an enemy, but someone as trapped by silence as Eleanor had been, and felt something shift in her chest. You are not a burden, Eleanor said quietly. You are a mother, trying to protect your son. Vivien's hands trembled in her lap. I have destroyed your marriage. She said firmly, No. My husband destroyed our marriage when he decided I could not be trusted with the truth. Mike, you asked for secrecy. He agreed. That was his choice, not yours. Vivien looked up at her, tears sliding down her pale cheeks. What will you do? Eleanor smoothed her skirts, picked up her gloves, and looked at the woman who had been the center of 3 months of misery. I am going to speak to my husband. She left the townhouse and climbed into her carriage. As the horses pulled away from the square, Eleanor looked out the window at the modest building and thought, the woman I hated is the woman I should have helped. Eleanor returned to Ashworth that evening and found Sebastian in the library. He was sitting in the dark, alone, with a letter in his hands. The paper was old, seawater stained, the edges frayed. Eleanor recognized it immediately. Robert's confession. She closed the door behind her and crossed the room. Sebastian did not move. She sat in the chair beside him, not touching, and said, Is that Robert's letter? He nodded and then handed it to her without a word. She read it again. Robert's handwriting, Robert's guilt, Robert's plea to take care of Vivien and the boy. She folded the letter carefully, placed it on the desk between them, and said, She's dying. He said quietly, I know. You have been sitting with her while her son sleeps, reading to the boy. Robert asked me to. Silence filled the library. Outside, the light faded from gold to gray. You should have told me, Eleanor said quietly. Any of it. All of it. He said simply, Yes. She leaned her shoulder into his, the first voluntary contact in months. He did not pull away. After a long moment, he turned his head, and his cheek rested against her temple. And they sat in the dark, not speaking, while the room grew cold around them. "I thought I was my mother," Eleanor said finally. "I thought I was watching her marriage happen to me." Sebastian's voice was rough. "I thought I was protecting you by managing what you knew. I was deciding for you what you could bear. And I called it protection. It was control." Neither of them moved. The intimacy was not resolution. It was the acknowledgement of mutual collision. Eleanor reached for his hand in the dark. His fingers closed around hers, and they sat together in silence until the clock struck midnight. The following night, Eleanor returned to the library with the documents Halford had returned to her and a letter of her own. Sebastian was at the desk, reviewing estate correspondence. He looked up as she entered, and his expression shifted. Wary, cautious, uncertain. She crossed the room, placed the documents on the desk in front of him, and set the second letter beside them. He looked at the documents, then at her. "What is this?" "Your brother's crime." She sat in the chair across from him. "And my solicitor's letter confirming the closure of the Hampshire cottage accounts." Sebastian picked up the second letter, read it, and looked at her. "You closed the account." She shook her head. "No. I transferred it into my own name. The cottage remains leased." He understood immediately. She was choosing to stay, but not surrendering the capacity to leave. "Eleanor, your brother robbed her," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "You spent 18 months trying to give it back, but you never told me. She asked me not to. And you decided her request outweighed my right to know why my husband stopped being present in his own marriage." Sebastian set the letter down. "Yes." Eleanor leaned forward. "That is not protection, Sebastian. That is a decision about what I was allowed to understand about my own life." He had no defense. He did not offer one. "You are right. I decided for you. I told myself it was loyalty. It was control." She pushed the restitution documents across the desk toward him. "Finish what you started. Restore her lands. Keep Robert's secret if that is what keeps her son's inheritance intact. But you will never again decide what I am allowed to know about the life I share with you." He took the documents and then looked at the cottage account letter again. "You kept the cottage?" She confirmed, "Yes." "Why?" "Because a woman who stays should always know she can leave." She met his gaze. "That is the thing you failed to understand. My freedom to go is what makes my choice to stay mean something." Sebastian stood, crossed to her side of the desk, and knelt so they were eye level. "I will not decide for you again." She cupped his face in her hands. "No, you will not." She kissed him, not gently, not tentatively, but with the force of two people who had nearly lost each other to the wrong story. His hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers threading through her hair. Hers gripped the front of his coat, pulling him closer. The kiss was not reconciliation. It was reclamation. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. "Where I went to see her." Sebastian went still. "Vivien?" She confirmed, "Yes." "What did she say?" "That she asked you to carry her secret, and she knew it would cost you. That she was afraid for her son." Eleanor's voice softened. "That she was not mocking me. She was warning you." Sebastian closed his eyes. "I should have told you." She said quietly, "Yes. But I should have asked. I should have demanded the truth instead of assuming I already knew it." He opened his eyes and looked at her. We both failed. She said softly, yes. But we are still here. They stayed in the library until dawn, talking in low voices about Robert's crime, Vivien's illness, the restitution that still needed to be completed, when the first light crept through the windows. Eleanor fell asleep in the chair with Sebastian's coat draped over her shoulders. He did not wake her. He sat at the desk, watching her breathe, and thought, I almost lost this. Spring arrived 6 months later, and with it, a letter from the solicitor. Eleanor stood in the Ashworth garden, reading the final confirmation. The restitution was complete. Vivien's dowry lands had been legally restored to her son's name through a private settlement that left Robert's fraud unexposed. The boy's inheritance was secure. The widow's pension remained intact. Vivien had not lived to see it. She had died in January, with Sebastian and her son at her bedside. Eleanor folded the letter and looked at the garden around her. Green and alive. The borders filled with roses and lavender, and, in the corner beneath the library window, a white jasmine cutting she had planted in February. The scent that had once meant betrayal now grew in soil Eleanor had chosen. She walked back into the house and found Sebastian in the library, reading estate correspondence at the desk. She crossed the room, placed the solicitor's letter beside his papers, and sat in the chair beside him. He read the letter, then looked at her. It is finished, she confirmed. Yes. He set the letter down and reached for her hand. Vivien would have been grateful. She said quietly, I know. I am glad you kept your promise to Robert. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with the kind of guilt only an 8-year-old could produce. Mother, Thomas said, his voice small. James drew on the wall again. Eleanor looked at Sebastian, and he was already smiling. She stood, crossed to the doorway, and looked at the library wall. Crayon marks, blue and green and red, stretched across the paneling in a child's attempt at a ship. She turned to Thomas. Which wall? He pointed. This one. Eleanor looked at the drawing, then at Sebastian, who had risen from his desk and was standing beside her. His hand found hers. Should we scold him? Sebastian asked, his voice low. Eleanor studied the crayon ship, lopsided, enthusiastic, unmistakably James's work. She thought about the salon door 9 months ago, the Hampshire cottage, the documents on the desk, the woman she had hated and then mourned. She looked at Sebastian. No. He asked, no? It is a wall, Eleanor said simply. It has survived worse damage than crayon. Sebastian's smile widened. He pulled her closer, his arm around her waist, and they stood together, looking at the mark their son had made on a room that had witnessed their collision and their recovery. Thomas, uncertain whether he was in trouble, shifted from foot to foot. Mother? Eleanor turned to him. Tell your brother that next time he should draw on paper. But this time we will leave it. Thomas's face brightened. Really? She confirmed. Really? He ran off, shouting for James, and Eleanor leaned into Sebastian's side. The cottage account, Sebastian said quietly. You have not used it. She said simply, no, I have not needed it. You should keep it. Why? Because a woman who stays should always know she can leave. That was the thing I failed to understand. Your freedom to go is what makes your choice to stay mean something. Eleanor reached up, cupped his face in her hands, and kissed him. I am staying, he said quietly. I know. But I am keeping the cottage. He said simply, good. They stood in the library, surrounded by crayon marks and legal correspondence and the life they had almost lost. And Eleanor thought, this is what my mother never had. This is what I have kept. Outside, the jasmine bloomed beneath the window, white and fragrant, a scent that no longer meant betrayal, but something harder won and far more valuable. A marriage built not on certainty, but on the willingness to learn what they did not know.